You felt everything, too much, too often, and too honestly. You cared when no one asked you to. You gave when they didn't even say thank you. You stayed long after they went silent. You listened to the things they didn't say. You read into the pauses, into the tone, into the energy. You wanted to understand. You wanted to fix. That was your biggest mistake, trying to fix something that was never supposed to be yours to carry. They saw it early, the way your heart moved, the way you'd break your own rhythm to stay in tune with theirs. You'd explain your feelings gently, hoping they'd meet you with clarity, but they didn't. They met your softness with silence, your vulnerability with sarcasm, your presence with absence, and still you stayed because you believed they just needed time, that maybe they were hurting, that maybe they weren't ready. You gave reasons for their behavior they never even tried to give themselves. You loved with clarity, they loved with confusion. Or maybe they didn't love at all, maybe they just enjoyed being wanted, being needed. You gave meaning to things they left undefined. They liked the power of being chased, of being emotionally fed without having to do anything in return. They'd go quiet just to see if you'd reach out first. And you did, every time, until you realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was planned. You started noticing the cycle. They'd pull away right when things got close. You'd blame yourself. You'd start questioning everything, your words, your timing, your tone. They rarely said much, just enough to keep you hanging, just enough to stop you from walking away. And that was the game. You weren't in a connection. You were in a maze with no exit, designed to keep you questioning your worth while they held on to their control. You made excuses, told yourself they were healing, that they weren't used to someone like you, that maybe your love scared them. You watered down your needs, shrunk yourself just to keep the peace. You stopped asking for more, started taking what little they gave and calling it enough. You became emotionally exhausted trying to prove you were safe, that you weren't going to leave, that your love wasn't a threat, and all it did was give them more control. They weren't confused, they were calculated, not in an evil way, but in a selfish one. They liked the attention, the emotional safety net, the knowledge that no matter how distant they became, you'd still be there, still trying, still hoping, still hurting silently. It wasn't about love. It was about having someone on standby, someone to pour into them while they offered nothing back. You were open, they were closed. You spoke, they shrugged. You asked questions, they gave half answers. You gave context, they gave confusion. You wanted honesty, they wanted power, and still you gave them the benefit of the doubt, again and again, because you weren't raised to abandon people when they're struggling, because you believed in being the bigger person, because you thought being kind meant being available, no matter how they treated you. But the more you gave, the less they respected it. They didn't value your empathy. They used it because it was easy, because it cost them nothing, because you made it effortless to be indifferent. They never had to show up. They never had to say sorry. You always smoothed it over. You always justified their silence. You let them lead, even when the direction was nowhere. You spent more time trying to understand them than you ever did protecting yourself. You ignored the exhaustion, ignored the red flags. You thought love was supposed to be hard, that if you just loved them right, they'd change. They didn't. They didn't want to, because your emotional effort became their comfort zone. You became the place they went to feel powerful, not loved, to feel adored, not accountable. It was never a fair exchange. You kept giving in the hope it would someday balance, but it never did. The more you gave, the more they took. The more patient you were, the more distant they became, and still you tried. Until one day, you stopped. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because something in you went quiet, tired, detached, done. They noticed, slowly, subtly. The emotional supply they fed on started to fade. Your replies got shorter. Your questions stopped. Your need to be understood disappeared. You stopped showing up with explanations. You stopped hoping for change. You stopped adjusting your softness to fit their coldness. And the power they once had? Gone. They didn't know what to do with your silence, your absence, your indifference, because it was never about loving you. It was about knowing you always would. When that stopped, the game ended. You were always the empath in a rigged system. But the moment you stopped playing, the system broke. And that's when you finally felt free. They made it look like care. That's what made it hard to spot. The way they'd randomly check in, send sweet messages, give you attention just when you started questioning everything. It wasn't consistent, but it was timed perfectly. Just enough to keep you wondering, just enough to make you stay. At first, it felt special. The way they pulled you in made you feel seen. You didn't notice the shifts, the way they withdrew when you got close, the way they went silent when you needed them. You excused it. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were going through something. You blamed their distance on your own expectations. You made excuses they never had to say out loud. You didn't realize it was a pattern, that they gave you just enough love to make you crave more, then pulled away to make you chase it. You thought the connection was real. They let you believe it. They let you pour your heart out, let you attach. And right when you were comfortable, they'd shift, colder, less present, sharper with their words. You thought maybe you were being sensitive, maybe you expected too much, maybe your idea of love was broken. So you tried harder, tried to match their energy, tried to stay quiet when things hurt. You convinced yourself it was just a rough patch, that all relationships have highs and lows. But this wasn't a low, it was a game, and you didn't know the rules. They never said what they wanted. They kept it vague, made you guess, responded just enough to keep you hooked. And when you asked for clarity, they turned it back on you. Said you were being dramatic, needy, said you were reading too much into things. You started questioning your reality. You replayed conversations, trying to see where you messed up, but the problem was never you. It was control. They used affection like a weapon. Kindness became a currency, and you were always in debt. They'd love bomb you when you pulled back and punish you when you got too close. They wanted your loyalty without giving you stability. They wanted your emotional investment without offering commitment, and you gave it because they trained you to think that love was earned, that you had to prove yourself. You stayed longer than you should have, hoping the version of them you saw in the beginning would return, hoping the cold moments were just temporary. You waited for the warmth to come back, and when it did, you convinced yourself it was worth it. The emotional roller coaster felt like passion. You didn't know it was manipulation. You thought love was supposed to be earned, that you had to be patient, understanding, that real connection took work. But this wasn't work. It was survival. You were holding your breath, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying not to ask for too much, trying not to scare them away. But you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for the bare minimum. They knew what they were doing. They weren't confused. They read your silence. They watched your reactions. They fed off your uncertainty. Every time you questioned where you stood, they gained more control. You became predictable. You'd chase, you'd explain, you'd apologize for being hurt, and they'd say you were too emotional. You lost yourself in that pattern, lost your voice, your clarity, your peace. You started shrinking just to keep the connection alive. You started ignoring your own needs to meet theirs. You stopped asking questions, stopped expressing how you felt. And they liked that. They liked you uncertain, because when you were uncertain, they were powerful. You didn't notice how much of yourself you gave up. Not at first. It started slow, a skipped boundary here, an ignored red flag there. You brushed it off, told yourself it wasn't worth arguing about. But every time you let it slide, you taught them how to treat you. You taught them what they could get away with, and they learned fast. They made it seem like your reaction was the problem, not their behavior. They told you to calm down when you finally spoke up, said you were making things worse, that you were overanalyzing. You started questioning your instincts. You stopped trusting yourself, and they liked that. Because a version of you that doubted everything was easier to manipulate. They gave you attention when they felt you slipping. They knew when to pull you back in, when to send the message, when to act right. Just enough to reset the cycle. Just enough to make you think things were finally changing. You held on to those small moments, ignored the larger truth. The truth was, they were never confused. They were just calculated. They were never unsure. They were just unwilling. They didn't want love. They wanted control, and you gave it to them. Not because you were weak, but because you believed it was real. Because you wanted to believe in someone who never planned to give you anything real. You called it connection. They called it fun. You called it love. They called it control. They liked having you on edge, liked knowing you were affected, that their absence could change your day, that their silence could live rent-free in your head. They didn't need to yell, they just needed to withhold, and it worked. Until it didn't, until you started noticing the pattern, until you started choosing yourself in small ways, until their silence stopped shaking you, until your peace became more important than their approval. And that was the beginning of the end. Not for you, but for their game. Because the only way to break the cycle is to stop participating in it. And once you stopped reacting, they lost the one thing they were feeding on, your attention. They knew what they were doing. Every silence wasn't an accident. Every ignored message had intent behind it. Every vague comment was designed to unsettle you. They wanted a reaction. That's how they felt important, not through real connection, but through control. They liked knowing they could shake your peace without raising their voice. It wasn't about what they said. It was what they didn't say, what they withheld, what they left unsaid, just enough to leave you guessing. You used to wonder what you did wrong. You replayed conversations in your head, looked for the mistake, blamed yourself for the coldness. You thought maybe you were too much, too emotional, too needy, but you weren't. You were just human. You wanted clarity. They wanted confusion. Because confusion kept you attached. Confusion made you work harder, made you try to prove your worth, made you chase answers to questions they never planned on answering. They called you sensitive when you brought it up, said you were overthinking, said they were joking, but nothing about how you felt was funny. You noticed the change in tone, the way their energy shifted for no reason, the subtle digs disguised as humor, the delayed replies, the sudden coldness. And every time you reacted, they felt in control again. That was the game. Push, then pull, hurt, then charm, ignore, then guilt trip. And you kept falling for it. because you thought love required understanding. You didn't realize they were training you to doubt yourself. You learned the pattern over time, the silence after something meaningful, the passive-aggressive comment when you were finally calm, the dry response after you opened up. They weren't unaware. They were watching, measuring, seeing how long it would take for you to break, to text again, to ask what's wrong, to chase the connection. They never said what they wanted, but they made sure you knew when they were displeased, not with words, with withdrawal, with absence, with emotional distance that hit you harder than any argument ever could. It worked for a while, because you had a heart, because you cared too much. You filled in the blanks for them. You tried to fix what they wouldn't acknowledge. You started managing both sides of the relationship, yours and theirs. You excused the silence, justified the coldness, blamed their past, their trauma, their stress. But nothing changed, because they weren't trying to heal, they were trying to dominate. And the more confused you got, the more invested you became. That's what made it so cruel. You worked harder for someone who was giving you less, and they loved that. They mistook your care for desperation, your empathy for weakness, your honesty for a lack of self-respect. But what they didn't see was what all that silence was building inside you. It wasn't breaking you, it was teaching you. You told everyone what you wanted. It was teaching you how you came across, how you stopped reacting one day. Not out of spite, not to play the game back, but because you had nothing left to say. No more confusion, no more wondering what went wrong, no more chasing understanding from someone who never wanted to be understood. You didn't send a final message, you didn't explain your silence, you just disconnected. Quietly, finally, and they noticed. They always notice. At first, they waited, thought it was another cycle, another round of you needing space, only to come back. But you didn't. You didn't post anything dramatic. You didn't block them for attention. You just removed yourself from the game entirely. You took back your energy. You stopped feeding the dynamic. That's when the panic starts, when their power slips, when they realize you're not trying anymore, when the silence is mutual, when their games echo into nothing. Because what they wanted was the reaction, the emotional tug-of-war, the validation of knowing they could still affect you. But when you go still, when you go silent, the game ends, and they have nothing to push against. No buttons to press, no buttons to press, no control. They test it, though. A message, just vague enough to pull you back in. A comment, a story viewed, a missed call at the wrong hour. They want to know if the hook still works, if you'll bite, if there's still a version of you that needs them to choose you. But that version of you is gone, starved from too much hoping, too much begging, too much explaining. Now they sit with their silence. But it doesn't give them power anymore. It gives them a mirror, one they never expected to face, because you're not reacting, you're not chasing, you're not playing, you're calm. And nothing scares a manipulator more than a calm target. Someone who no longer needs closure, who no longer needs to win the argument, who no longer answers chaos with curiosity. You see it for what it was now. The games, the power shifts, the emotional crumbs. You don't hate them, you just don't engage. You don't want revenge, you want peace. And you're willing to lose anyone who disturbs it. You're not cold. You're just clear. Clear about what you allow. Clear about what respect looks like. Clear about never going back to a place that asked you to lose yourself to feel loved. They had control until you went quiet, until you stopped explaining, until you stopped reacting. That's when everything shifted, because their games don't work anymore. You're not playing, and you never will again. You spent so long trying to keep them, holding tight to someone who made letting go look easy. You softened your voice when you wanted to scream, bit your tongue until it bled, apologized for things you didn't do. You were always the first to reach out, to fix, to make peace. Even when they caused the chaos, you told yourself it was worth it, that love meant staying, even when it hurt. You thought effort would eventually be returned. It never was. You adjusted yourself over and over, shrinking in small ways, laughing at things that weren't funny, saying you were fine when you were not. They never noticed the compromises, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't care to. The more you gave, the less they valued it. You lowered your standards, hoping they would rise. They didn't. They got comfortable, entitled. They expected your forgiveness before they even said sorry. You told yourself it was just a phase, that things would get better. You remembered the good moments, stretched them out to cover all the bad. But the truth was right in front of you. You weren't being loved. You were being tolerated, used. And you stayed because the idea of losing them terrified you more than losing yourself. So you made yourself smaller, more agreeable, less emotional. You became easy to love, at the cost of your soul. You ignored the way your stomach sank when they texted one-word replies. You justified their coldness, their distance. You made excuses for their silence. They're just busy. They're not good with emotions. You filled in the blanks with hope. But the truth is, when someone wants you, you won't be confused about it. And you were confused all the time. That was your first sign. They didn't have to say it. You could feel it. In their absence, in the energy shift, in how hard you had to try just to keep the connection alive. You were carrying the weight for both of you, planning everything, initiating every conversation, holding the space for two. And still, you told yourself, at least they haven't left. But staying physically and leaving emotionally feels the same. And you were alone long before they actually disappeared. You tolerated their inconsistency like it was normal. They came and went as they pleased, and you called it love because when they were there, it felt like enough. But they only gave you just enough to keep you hoping. A compliment here, a soft moment there, then silence again. You were starving, but they convinced you it was a feast. You started losing yourself in the waiting for replies, waiting for them to change, waiting for them to finally choose you the way you chose them. You'd check your phone too often, read their messages too many times, replay conversations in your head, trying to figure out where it started going wrong. You blamed yourself, thought maybe if you were more secure, more patient, less emotional, they'd love you better. So you adjusted, again and again and again. You became someone else, someone quieter, nicer, more passive. You said yes when you wanted to say no. You accepted behavior that made your chest tighten. You allowed yourself to be gaslit, manipulated, breadcrumbed, all in the name of trying. But the truth was, you were the only one trying, and they knew it. You ignored your gut, that voice inside you that whispered, "This isn't love." You shut it down, told yourself you were being too sensitive, too dramatic. You clung to the potential, the idea of who they could be. You saw their good moments and believed that was the real version. You didn't realize that who people are consistently, that's who they are. And they were consistently distant, careless. Oh, you remember the night it all cracked, when you looked at yourself and didn't recognize the reflection. Eyes tired, spirit dim, voice barely a whisper. You had spent so long molding yourself to their comfort that you lost your own. And in that moment, you asked the one question that changed everything. What are you even holding on to? Was it real? Or just a fantasy stitched together with memory and hope? Were you in love with them? Or with the idea of being loved back? And if it's love, why does it feel like survival? Why does it feel like silence, waiting, begging, bending? You didn't have the answers then, but the questions were enough to finally stop explaining, stop chasing, stop trying to earn what should have been given freely. It hurt, more than you could explain. Walking away from someone you once dreamed about isn't easy, but staying in a place where you're dying inside just to keep them comfortable, that's worse. So you let it end, not with a scream, not with a fight, with a quiet decision. You didn't need them to understand. You needed to breathe again. And in that silence, you finally did. You didn't scream. You didn't post about it. You didn't draft a final message or threaten to walk away if things didn't change. You just stopped showing up the same way, slowly, quietly, without effort or explanation. The shift wasn't loud, but it was real. You no longer answered immediately, no longer overthought your words, no longer chased conversations that always left you empty. You started to breathe again, not heavily, not in desperation, just naturally, peacefully. You didn't owe them a warning. They had all the signs, the emotional withdrawals, the exhausted silences, the way your voice started sounding more like survival than connection. They just never took you seriously. They thought you were bluffing, that your silence was just another round in the game. But you weren't playing anymore. You were tired, and something inside you finally stopped hoping they'd understand. They noticed it, not instantly. They still tried their usual tactics, delayed replies, subtle jabs, passive withdrawal, waiting for you to crack. But you didn't. They expected the version of you who would ask what's wrong, who would panic over cold energy, who would question everything to fix the nothing they gave. That version was gone. You didn't disappear out of peace to someone who mistook it for permission. Their silence used to own you. It used to pull you into overthinking. You used to obsess over what you said wrong, what you could do better. You'd spiral in the silence they left, thinking it was your fault. But not anymore. You started seeing it for what it was. A tactic. Control dressed as withdrawal. Manipulation hiding behind indifference. You used to feed it with effort. Now you starve it with distance. You didn't respond to the bait, not the dry messages, not the vague behavior, not the inconsistency. You let it sit. You let them feel the absence, not to hurt them, but to protect you. The old you would have explained the silence, softened your tone, made excuses for them. Now you just watched it all happen, like you were finally outside the storm looking in. You realized you didn't have to be in it to feel strong. You just had to walk away. And when you stopped feeding the system, it broke. The power dynamic shattered. They lost control, not just of the narrative, but of you. You weren't predictable anymore. You weren't emotionally available on demand. They couldn't trigger the same response. The game they built on pushing you to chase them now worked against them, because now they were the ones watching, waiting, wondering, and you were just living. You didn't ghost, you didn't vanish with anger. You became emotionally unavailable to the nonsense. Your responses got shorter, your effort dropped. You didn't match energy, you outgrew it. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't strategy, it was peace. A type of quiet they couldn't manipulate, a calm they couldn't reach. They tried small things at first, reactions, story views, random comments, half-hearted messages, waiting to see if you'd fold. But you didn't. You didn't block them. You didn't engage. You didn't flinch. And that confused them more than anything. Because when someone's used to playing games with you, your disinterest is louder than anger. You knew how they operated. You'd studied their cycles while they assumed you weren't paying attention. You learned the timing, the patterns, the highs they'd throw you, the lows they'd drop you into. You stopped asking if it was love. You stopped justifying the discomfort. You called it what it was: manipulation. You didn't argue about it. You just refused to participate. They wanted to see you react. They always did. That's where the power was for them, in knowing they could shake you, in watching you unravel while they stayed distant. It wasn't about connection. It was about control. But now, you're not giving them that moment. You're not handing them the response that validates their behavior. You stopped giving them anything. And when they realized that, the game ended. They could feel it in the lack of explanation, the absence of your emotion, the dry way you said okay instead of explaining why something hurt, the slow fade of someone who used to give too much. Now, you don't give enough to be used. Now you protect your peace like it's currency. They didn't expect this. They expected another cycle, another recovery, another round of you proving your worth. But the one thing they never planned for was indifference. Not anger, not bitterness, just stillness, just space. And once that arrived, everything changed. You no longer fear the silence. You don't internalize it. You don't read into it. You understand it now. It's not a puzzle. It's just absence. You don't chase it. You don't question it. You match it, or you walk. You learn that people who love you clearly don't leave you confused. They don't play chess with your heart. They show up with consistency, with clarity, with care. They were never confused. They were just never serious. And now you are serious about your energy, about your time, about your peace. You don't perform softness for people who call it weakness. You don't give access to people who treated your love like a convenience. They're still trying to play, but you're not even in the room anymore. You're gone, quietly, fully, finally. They feel it before they admit it. At first, it's subtle. You take a little longer to respond. Your tone isn't warm anymore. The words are shorter, fewer exclamation points, less softness in your voice. No more checking in first, no more overthinking your messages. You're still there, but only barely. Present, but not emotionally available. They think it's temporary. They think it's mood. They think they can fix it the same way they always did, with fake charm, mixed signals, and carefully timed attention. But you're not responding the same way anymore. That's the first sign. Then comes the space. You don't bring up the conversations anymore. You don't try to explain the silence. You don't ask where they've been or why the energy shifted. You just let things sit, the way they always let your feelings sit in discomfort. They're used to you chasing balance, fixing tension. Now, you let the tension hang in the room without rushing to break it. You let it stay quiet. You let them feel it. They thought you'd never pull back, that no matter what they did, you'd stay consistent. They expected your loyalty to override your boundaries, but now they're calling, and you're not answering. They're sending messages and getting hours of silence. They're watching you go about your life, not clinging to them like you used to. And suddenly, they realize the game isn't fun without your reaction. It's just empty moves on a broken board. You used to give them everything. Your time, your energy, your thoughts. You used to explain your silence. You used to try and meet them halfway even when they never moved. But something in you changed. Not out of spite, not out of revenge. You just saw the pattern too clearly this time. You saw how it was always you trying to maintain connection. You saw how they only came close when they felt you pulling away. They don't know how to handle this version of you. The calm one, the quiet one. The one who no longer argues, no longer explains, no longer reacts. Your peace unsettles them because it's real, because it isn't performative, because you're no longer giving them power through your pain. You've stopped bleeding for them to notice you, and now they're noticing. But it's too late. They thought emotional distance was a game, a way to keep control, but now they're on the other side of it. Now they're the ones rereading old texts, comparing your tone, searching for signs of hope. Now they're the ones wondering why the energy feels so different. It's because the chase is over, and without your reaction, they don't know who they are anymore in your world. They used to feed off your insecurities, off your need for clarity. You used to ask if everything was okay, used to try to fix problems they created. But now, you let it go unanswered. You no longer try to repair what they keep breaking. You no longer speak into silence hoping to hear something back. You let it stay quiet, and that silence is louder than anything you ever said. The distance doesn't start with blocking or removing. It starts with detachment. It starts with seeing them clearly, watching the patterns repeat, and choosing not to participate this time. It starts with hearing their half-hearted apologies and choosing not to respond with comfort. It starts with valuing your peace over their approval. That's what they notice first. That you're not reacting with your usual softness, that you've grown past needing them to understand. They try small things to check if they still have access. Random texts, inside jokes, posts meant to trigger a response. But you don't flinch. You don't bite. You scroll past. Not because you're pretending to be unbothered, but because you genuinely don't care the way you used to. Your focus has shifted. Your world no longer revolves around the possibility of their love. And that shift, it breaks their illusion. They can't play the game anymore because the board is empty. Because you took your energy back. Your silence is now the consequence. Your calm is the closure. And that's something they never prepared for. They expected the old cycle to repeat. They expected you to bend again. But you're not bending. You're not even there. You've disconnected so completely that their words bounce off the walls you built for yourself. They start reaching in new ways, trying to be sincere, trying to show growth, but even that feels rehearsed, because they never changed for the right reason. They changed because they lost their supply. They changed because silence starved their ego, because their power was never about love. It was about reaction. And now that you're done reacting, they don't know how to connect. Your stillness has become the loudest truth, the message they can't ignore. You used to flood them with feeling. Now you don't even make waves. You live, you heal, you grow, quietly, without the need to prove anything. And they watch, from a distance they created, from a gap they can't close. They remember who you were, and they miss it, but they don't miss you for the right reasons. They miss who you were for them, who you allowed them to be, and when they lose access to that, they panic, because it was never about partnership, it was about control, and now they've lost it. You're no longer playing, not the game, not the role, not the version of you that used to cling to people who only came close when they felt you slipping. You're not slipping anymore. You've stepped back with intention, and the silence, it's permanent. its peace, and its power they can't touch. They needed you more than they admitted, not because they loved you, not because they valued you, but because you gave them something they couldn't find anywhere else. Attention, presence, emotional reflection. You were the mirror that showed them someone still cared, someone still tried. You kept them relevant in a world they feared would forget them. You were always the first to ask if they were okay, always the one to notice shifts in their mood, always the one to show up even when they made it hard to love them. You gave them room to be inconsistent while staying consistent yourself. They grew used to that, dependent on it. They didn't have to say much. You'd feel it, sense the change, respond, reassure. They didn't have to try because you always did. It wasn't love they craved. It was control. The kind of control that made them feel powerful when you overextended yourself. They would withdraw just to watch you come closer, say less just to make you say more. You thought you were being patient, being loyal, being understanding, but all you were doing was feeding their ego, keeping their identity intact. They used your effort as proof that they were still wanted, still worthy, still needed. And then one day, you stopped, not with a fight, not with an outburst. You just got quiet, slower to respond, slower to engage. You started hearing them clearly, without emotion distorting the message. You saw the pattern, the cycle, the manipulation behind their silence, the motives behind their inconsistency, and something inside you just shut off. Not out of hate, out of exhaustion. Now they don't know what to do, because you were the emotional center of the relationship, the balance, the gravity. Without your reaction, they're floating, confused, checking their phone more often, watching your stories, posting things they hope you'll notice, leaving doors half open, dropping breadcrumbs. But you're not chasing. You're not decoding mixed signals. You're not sending the follow-up texts. You've exited the game. They miss the way you made them feel, but they won't say it. Their ego won't allow it, so instead they test you. A like here, a random message there, a sudden memory shared, casually. They're not trying to reconnect. They're trying to see if the switch in you is real, if you've really gone quiet, if they still matter. But they don't ask directly. That would require honesty. They don't know how to handle the silence. They don't know how to sit with themselves without the constant affirmation you used to give. Your chaos, the emotions, the talks, the energy, was fuel for them. You called it connection, they called it power. You were emotionally invested, they were emotionally entertained. Now, without you feeding them, they're empty, and they hate it. They act like they're fine. They post like everything's normal. But behind that performance is restlessness. Your silence echoes, not because it's loud, but because it used to be filled with so much attention. Now, there's nothing. Just space they thought they'd never have to live in. Your absence is loud because your presence was never small. You used to argue, used to defend yourself, try to explain your perspective. You used to want peace more than pride. You thought being clear would make them care, but nothing changed. They didn't want resolution, they wanted reaction. Your pain validated their power, your confusion made them feel secure. But the moment you stopped explaining, they lost the upper hand. They never expected you to detach. They thought you'd always show up, eventually, even after being ignored, even after being disrespected. They underestimated what silence does to a person who's been hurt too many times. It doesn't make them colder. It makes them clearer. more still, more precise with what they tolerate. Now they're stuck with the absence, not the kind that begs for attention, the kind that feels permanent, steady, final. They try to disrupt it, try to trigger a response, but your peace has no weak points anymore. You've closed every door with calm hands, locked them with intention, not to punish, to protect. They thought they could come and go, that you'd always be there, waiting, that your emotions would keep you hooked, but they were wrong. You don't need to be angry to let go. You don't need closure to stay gone. You don't need them to admit what they did. You just needed to stop needing them, and that's exactly what happened. You became someone they can't reach anymore. Not emotionally, not mentally, not energetically, and they feel that. They scroll through old messages, remembering the version of you that over-cared, over-loved, over-explained. That version isn't gone because of them. That version evolved in spite of them. You stopped arguing, stopped proving, stopped feeding their ego. They can't play the same games when you're no longer reacting. They can't control the narrative when you stop showing up for the performance. Their moves don't make sense anymore because the opponent has left the board. And that silence, it's louder than anything you ever said. Let them guess. Let them wonder. Let them talk. You owe nothing. The game ended when you stopped playing, and they know it. That's why they keep watching. You used to think closure was a conversation. You thought if you could just sit across from them, explain everything, ask your questions, get honest answers, it would help. That you'd feel lighter, that you'd finally understand what went wrong. You imagined they'd listen, maybe apologize, maybe even admit they failed you. But you waited too long for something that never came. The apology, the accountability, the truth. You kept chasing clarity from people who couldn't even give you honesty. They knew what they did. They just didn't care enough to fix it. And that's the part you avoided. That's what took time to accept. That some people aren't confused. They're just selfish. And when they're finished taking, they vanish. No goodbye, no explanation, just distance. And you sit there, replaying it all, wondering if it was you, wondering if you were too much, too sensitive, too needy. You weren't. You were just available to someone who never planned to value that access. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a decision, a silent one, the kind that doesn't need to be announced, the kind that comes after one too many ignored messages, after one too many moments where your presence felt optional. It starts in the pit of your chest, the slow realization that they're not coming back, and even if they did, it wouldn't change anything. They've already shown you everything you needed to know. You don't need to know why they stopped trying. You don't need to know what they thought of you. You don't need to hear them say they messed up. You already know. You felt it in the way they became comfortable with your pain, in the way they could go days without checking in the way they created confusion and called it love. You saw it clearly once you stopped making excuses for them. Some endings don't come with fire. They don't explode, they fade, quietly, like they never existed. But the ache they leave behind is loud. You sit with it. At first it feels unbearable, because you didn't just lose them. You lost the future you were building in your head, the idea of them, the version you created that never really matched who they were. And letting go of that version hurts more than letting go of the person. You wanted to fix things, talk things through. You wanted one last moment to be heard, but they weren't interested. They weren't willing. So you stopped. You stopped texting first. You stopped checking in. You stopped explaining your silence. And in that silence, you found something they never gave you: peace. Distance teaches you everything they never said. It shows you who checks in, who notices your absence, who circles back when you stop chasing. Most won't, because they were never really there to begin with. They were just there for what you gave, what you softened, what you allowed. And when that ends, they have no reason to stay. You wanted resolution, but what you needed was distance. Because distance exposes truth. It removes the noise, it clears the fog. And in that space, you begin to see how little effort they made, how loud your love was, and how quiet theirs stayed. And eventually, you accept that no amount of closure can heal what someone broke intentionally. You stop waiting for the message, the call, the explanation. You stop writing drafts you'll never send. You stop rehearsing words for people who never heard you in the first place. You stop begging the past to rewrite itself. The door doesn't slam shut. It locks quietly. And this time, you don't stand there holding the key. Some people don't deserve closure, not because they're evil, but because they already closed the door with their actions. They showed you what they thought of you when they left you unread, when they downplayed your pain, when they blamed you for caring too much. That was the closure. It just didn't come wrapped in the words you were hoping for. You start learning how to live without explanations. You wake up one day and don't check your phone. You hear a song that used to hurt and feel nothing. You scroll past their name without stopping. It doesn't mean you're healed. It means you've accepted that healing doesn't need their participation. You stop arguing with yourself, stop replaying moments looking for something to change. You stop romanticizing how it could have ended better. The ending was never yours to write, but the next chapter is, and it starts with silence. It starts with you choosing yourself in the absence of their effort. You don't fight to be understood anymore. You don't explain your worth to people who never saw it. You don't light yourself on fire to prove your warmth. You don't go back to relive pain disguised as closure. You move without announcement, without guilt, without permission. You know now. Distance is louder than closure. It says everything they refused to say. It makes them wonder, makes them reflect, makes them question. And even if they never admit it, they feel it. That silence, it's their echo now. And your peace, it's not up for negotiation. Not everything needs to be said. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some stories end quietly, without drama, without final words, just space, just absence, just peace where pain used to live. And in that space, you find yourself again. Not bitter, not broken, just done, completely done. You used to trade your peace for company. You stayed in rooms that drained you just to avoid being alone. You laughed at jokes that weren't funny, sat through conversations that left you feeling empty, kept connections alive just because you were afraid of silence. But over time, silence started to feel safer than false connection. That shift changed everything. You stopped needing noise to feel something. You stopped needing people to validate you. Validation that came at the cost of your self-worth didn't feel like love anymore. You could feel when someone was using guilt to hold you close, when they twisted your loyalty into obligation, when their presence came with strings. At first, you tolerated it. Now, you don't. They used to say things with a smile that stung, make comments that disguised disrespect as humor, playful jabs that always seemed to hit the part of you still healing. You'd laugh it off, try not to take it personally, but it was personal, and you knew it, and still you stayed. You didn't want to be the one who took things too seriously, but now you see it for what it was. Disrespect dressed up as personality. You don't entertain it anymore. You walk away from the comment mid-sentence. You change the subject or go silent. You don't play along, because playing along gave them permission, and you've revoked that now. You're not mean. You're just done being everyone's emotional landing pad. You're not available for passive-aggressive games masked as closeness. They used to use guilt like a leash. After everything I've done for you, you used to care more. I guess you're too good for us now. You used to feel small hearing those things. You used to stay just to prove them wrong, to show you weren't the bad one. But guilt disguised as love isn't love, it's control. And the price was your peace. Now you choose peace every time, even when it looks like walking away from someone you once couldn't imagine life without, even when it means being alone for a while, even when people call you distant, because peace doesn't ask you to explain yourself. Peace doesn't interrupt your healing. Peace doesn't come with condition. There were moments where your silence made them uncomfortable. They asked what was wrong, why you were acting off. You gave short answers, not because you were hiding, but because you didn't owe them a performance. Your peace came from not reacting, not explaining, not fixing what they kept breaking. You don't flinch anymore when someone pulls away. You don't chase after energy that withdraws. If someone pulls back, you let them. If someone shows inconsistency, you don't question it. You let it answer itself. You've stopped confusing temporary attention with genuine presence. People show you what they value by what they protect. If they didn't protect you, they didn't value you. Simple. And there was a time you thought love had to be hard, that being close to someone meant tolerating things that hurt you. But now you know love without peace isn't love. It's dependency. It's survival. It's fear pretending to be loyalty. You've outgrown that. You don't want someone who keeps coming back. You want someone who never gives you a reason to leave. You stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt when their patterns screamed otherwise. You stopped trying to prove you're enough to people who never once met you halfway. You stopped over-explaining your heart just to be seen. You let your actions speak. You let your silence say everything your words no longer will. You had to teach yourself that it's okay to lose people who were never really with you, that peace sometimes feels like grief in the beginning, that disconnection feels like punishment before it feels like healing. But once it settles, once it sinks in, you realize you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong people. You're not bitter, you're not cold, you're just not performing anymore. You don't say yes when your gut says no. You don't smile when the room feels wrong. You don't pretend you're okay just to keep the atmosphere light. You show up honest. If it's too much, you leave. If they take it personally, that's not your problem anymore. They used to mistake your tolerance for love, your silence for submission, but it was patience, it was grace, it was restraint. And now that you've withdrawn all of it, they don't know how to act. They poke, they test, they try to get a reaction. But your peace doesn't respond to chaos anymore. You don't need to be liked. You don't need to be understood. You don't need to be invited. You need to be calm. And sometimes being calm means cutting off what once kept you company. Because not everything that feels familiar is good for you. You learned that the hard way. They feel the difference now. They notice your absence, your distance, your silence. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped opening it. You didn't announce your exit, you just stopped participating. They're still playing the game, but you're no longer in the room. You don't regret leaving. You regret staying as long as you did, the nights you lost sleep over someone who slept just fine after hurting you. The times you cried for people who wouldn't even check in. The way you ignored your own gut just to avoid conflict. You paid for that with your peace. Never again. Peace is expensive. It costs disconnection. It costs walking away from familiar patterns. It costs accepting that not everyone deserves a seat at your table, but it's always worth it, because now you rest differently, you wake up differently, you breathe easier. That silence that once scared you, it's the only thing that makes sense now. They still check if you've seen it. The post, the story, the comment made to stir something in you. They still say things they know will get back to you. Still talk to people you used to trust. Still throw jabs in silence, hoping you'll notice. But you don't. Not anymore. Not because you didn't see it, but because it no longer holds weight. They thought silence meant pause. They thought you'd be back, that you just needed time to cool off, that eventually you'd return to the game you always did before. After the silent treatments, after the cold stares, after being made to feel like you were asking for too much, you still showed up, still apologized first, still gave the benefit of the doubt, still cared when they didn't. But not now. They haven't caught on yet, haven't realized this isn't silence, it's absence. This isn't waiting, it's walking. You're not behind the curtain anymore. You're not checking their page. You're not rehearsing what you'd say if they reached out. That part of you, the one who needed closure or clarity or some twisted sense of mutual pain, that part is gone. It didn't happen overnight. You stayed too long. You explained too much. You tried too hard. And it exhausted you. You used to think walking away had to come with announcements, with final texts, with dramatic exits. Now you know better. Now you just leave, quietly, fully, and the silence says what words never could. They don't understand how you moved without making noise, how someone who used to react to every breadcrumb now doesn't even blink. But that's what happens when the games stop being entertaining. When you realize the whole thing was built on keeping you confused. They needed your confusion. It gave them time. It gave them power. Now, without your reactions, there's nothing for them to control. You don't ask about them anymore. Don't wonder what they're thinking. You've stopped assigning meaning to their actions. You see it for what it is, an attempt to maintain access. But you're not available. Not mentally. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. You close the door, not to hurt them, but to save yourself. You've outgrown it. The cycle, the manipulation masked as misunderstanding, the games that left you questioning your worth, the tests you never signed up to take. You're not explaining your side anymore, not clarifying your tone, not shrinking so someone else can feel secure in their own emptiness. You gave chances. Too many. They mistook your softness for dependence. Thought you'd never stop caring, that no matter what they said or did, you'd still pick up the call. But there's nothing left to pick up. You dropped the weight. You stopped trying to win a game where the rules only changed when you started catching on. They still watch you, still measure your silence, still hope for one more reaction, one more sign that you're still emotionally involved. But your peace speaks louder now. You don't need to correct them. Don't need to post about healing. You're not performing closure. You just live quietly, fully, without them. They remember the version of you that stayed, that one who forgave without repair, who kept trying to prove their intentions were good. They miss that version, not because they loved it, but because it made them feel powerful. That version let them feel superior without being honest. But it's gone, and you don't mourn it. You didn't become cold. You just stopped bleeding for people who handed you the knife. You stopped making excuses for patterns. You stopped justifying neglect. You see it now with clear eyes. How much time you spent inside a game you never asked to play. How many sleepless nights you spent trying to decode messages that weren't even written with care. They say you've changed. They whisper about how different you are now, how distant, but they never mention why. They never talk about the years you spent doubting yourself, the time you lost trying to be enough. They just feel the shift and call it attitude. They feel the silence and mistake it for pride. But it's neither. It's healing. There is no satisfaction in knowing they miss you, that they wonder why you disappeared. There's no pleasure in the idea that they regret losing you. You're not focused on their guilt. You're focused on your freedom, on the peace you feel not having to walk on eggshells, on the stillness of not needing to be seen by people who only watched when it benefited them. You don't hate them. You don't wish them harm, but you wish them far, far from your energy, far from your thoughts, far from the version of you they thought they owned. Because that version isn't coming back. Not now. Not ever. They don't realize the game ended the moment you stopped keeping score. The moment you stopped hoping they'd play fair. The moment you stopped responding. That was the final move. Not dramatic, not cruel, just clear. Just gone. You didn't disappear to hurt them. You disappeared to find yourself. And in that quiet, in that space you built without them, you realized you were never free while you were still reacting, still needing their approval, still craving their recognition. Now you have it. Freedom. And it didn't come with their respect. It came the moment you stopped asking for it.